Thank you guys. Thank you all for being here. I know it is the end of the semester. Things are getting a little tight with deadlines and everything, so I appreciate you guys being out here. Came in a little dressed up, just a bit. Dr. Chun always, comes out dripped out. I figured I'd give him a little bit of a run for his money, so here we are. Anyways, so my presentation is on Vcache and the effects of AMD's X3D implementation in their latest Ryzen CPUs. For this presentation, I want to ask a series of questions just to give us a layout or build a bit of a foundation to understand why Vcache is important. To start off is, what is a CPU? What are some limitations encountered within the CPU? What is the memory hierarchy? What are limitations outside of the CPU? So not the CPU itself, but any surrounding factors on it. What is cache? And by extension, what is Vcache? And finally, how has Vcache shaped AMD CPUs and how does it compete against their competitor, Intel, and any previous CPUs that they built before? So just to get started, we all know what the CPU is, the central processing unit. It is the primary processor in a computer that's capable of executing instructions very quickly. On this right-hand side here, I have a depiction of the Intel Core i9, specifically their 14900KF model. This is their last Core i9 CPU that they built using the foundry of Intel before they decided to switch over to their Ultra series. Now, typically when it comes to CPU, we focus on some specs, which are clock frequency, the number of cores that they have, which range between 4, 8, 16, 32. For CPUs dedicated to like server CPUs, we can even see upwards of 144 cores, specifically Intel Xeon 6780E. These are obviously overkill for any desktop CPU, but for server CPUs, they can be very useful for whatever use cases that they have for it. Next up is typically transistors, mainly the number of transistors that they have, but the more important factor that I've seen is the size of the architecture of the transistors. Nowadays, we're looking at transistors of size maybe 3 nanometers. Intel pivoted away from their Core i9 architecture because they introduced TSMC's architecture, which brought it down to 3 nanometers. Prior to the Ultra series, this CPU was using a 10 nanometer structure, but it was marketed as 7 nanometers to, I guess, compete against AMD's CPUs, which were already on TSMC. Last but not least is the cache. It is typically divided into 3 subsections, L1 or level 1, L2, L3, and in extremely rare cases, L4. This is rarely ever seen, but we'll be focusing on L3 cache, which is shared amongst all CPUs. L1 and L2 are private per core. Again, L3 is shared amongst CPUs, typically up to 8 cores. Anything above that, then they start getting their own dedicated L3 cache as well. Now, there are obviously other specialized processors that we've seen separate from a CPU, such as the graphics processing unit or a neural processing unit. The neural accelerator, for anyone familiar with the M series architecture, that's a specific MPU. So moving on with the limitations that we've encountered with the CPU, a lot of us in our presentations have already seen some limitations regarding speed up factor, right? We've discussed clock frequency being a heat and power wall. Essentially increasing the clock frequency hits a wall of diminishing returns, not necessarily in terms of performance, but in cost-effective production. So frequencies since about 2008 have stalled, mainly because it is just too much, it's too power hungry, it's too intensive to cool. And so, funnily enough, it's become a meme, but whenever new hardware comes out, but can it run Crysis is a question that is typically asked. For those that are unfamiliar with what Crysis is, it was a video game that was released in 2007 where the developers had a vision in where CPUs would eventually hit 10 gigahertz. 20 years later, that's not the case. And so even modern hardware, still lower end modern hardware, struggles to run this game at whatever performance metric that they're looking for. But I digress. Next limitation is Amdahl's law. We're all familiar with this in the parallelizability of our implementations, but essentially is even though we add more cores or throw more cores into the CPU, we hit a hard limit regarding the speed up factor simply because our software cannot be parallelized. And then the last one that I want to highlight specifically that AMD has been trying to target with their X3D implementation is the memory wall. What is the memory wall? Essentially anything that is the CPU is bound in which they need to wait to receive, or the CPU needs to wait to receive data outside of the CPU affects the CPU processing time. Hence, they need to wait. For example, a CPU sends a request to the main memory, it needs to wait 10 times or however long as opposed to a request that's on the cache. Now, to go into more specifics of the heat and power wall problem, we're all familiar with this equation here. But specifically this last implication where power is proportional to frequency cubed. Now, we all know that increasing frequency results in large power draws. Large power draws result in high temperatures. Extreme measures are needed to cool CPUs, and so we get some overclocking professionals that build very specific systems that you can see how unfeasible this is in a regular day-to-day environment. They're using liquid nitrogen to cool their CPU because they're hitting clock frequencies up to 8 gigahertz. I believe the world record right now is 9.1 gigahertz using the 14900K. Again, very, very unfeasible, not cost effective. And so hence why AMD is going towards the memory wall route. The next up, we've seen examples this semester already of embarrassingly parallel implementations versus inherently sequential, so the speed up factor that's limited by this aspect of any software that we're dealing with. We know that some tasks are very easy to parallelize, right? Just to name a few, the Monte Carlo method, being able to run 10,000 simulations in parallel or using whatever processing unit that can do that, convolutional neural networks that was discussed in a couple projects as well, and then obviously computer graphics, which has its own dedicated processor, the GPU. Other tasks, however, you can't parallelize because they rely on previous computations. These are known as inherently sequential. There's nothing that we can do regarding throwing more cores at it. There will be no speed up regarding these types of tasks because they are sequential, so they're going to be run on a single core anyways. And there's an analogy that's used for this. I decided to throw it in here, but you cannot use 9 pregnant women to make one baby in a month, or to make a baby in a month, because it's obviously a sequential process. You need the whole 9-month process, or about 9-month process to generate a human, right? So we're all familiar with this graph, so yeah. We'll move on to the memory hierarchy and a description of what it is. At the top, we have cache. Cache is at the top because it is the closest to the CPU, but it is also the least amount in size. So we're talking about kilobytes to 2 megabytes max per core. However, the bandwidth, the amount of data that it can process is enormous, up to 2 terabytes per second in some processors that we've seen. The next layer in this pyramid is the main memory, or RAM. In the current day and age, we use DDR5 is typically the highest rated RAM that we're using. These come in different sizes ranging from 4 gigabytes, which can be found on your phone, to some beefy supercomputers that can have 1 terabyte of RAM on them. Their bandwidth is roughly, at least in respects to DDR5, is up to 90 gigabytes per second. So you can see that discrepancy of several orders of magnitude between these two cache and main memory. And then last but not least is long-term storage. Long-term storage is mainly useful for the vast size that you can store files on. If anyone's familiar with NAS, building NASs at home, I personally have one. My hard drives are about 20 terabytes. They're a pretty penny, but they're nice for storing long-term files. However, its bandwidth with our fastest long-term storages, specifically M.2 NVMe's Gen 5, they can read and write up to about 13 gigabytes per second. So that is a large decrease between the two higher layers in this memory hierarchy. Now, just another quick depiction of just the CPU core, the L1, L2 cache being per core, L3 cache being shared. As we move down this graph, latency and capacity increase. However, if we move upwards, the amount of data that can be processed or the bandwidth of it increases. Now, interestingly enough, when CPUs and computer architecture was first designed, they were neck and neck in terms of performance and speed. However, since the 80s is when these speeds diverged and the memory wall was created. Now, just to get a more solid understanding of how all of these things work together, I want us to think about an analogy. Some of you guys may have heard this already, but it's the library analogy. Imagine you're in a library and these bookshelves represent the long-term storage. You have to go and seek whichever section your book is in, right? It's going to take some time, but you need to look for it. And in this library, you're on a table. This table is your workstation. Now, let's say you select a book and you put it on your workstation, you open it up and you're doing work, reading whatever data points. This book right here that's open and you're currently working on is representative of your L1, L2 cache. The table itself is representative of your L3 cache. These are books that you can easily reach over if you need to access data on them. So everything is nice and close, but you're limited in size, okay? Now, perhaps ahead of time, you don't have enough space on the table, but you set some books aside on a bookshelf or a book cart, for example. Things that you can easily acquire. This right here is your main memory. Now, it's not on the table, but it's close enough to you that you don't have to go to the bookshelf itself and look for whatever books that you need. This is main memory. Now, what AMD decided to do, and I think it's pretty clever, is if we ignore the laws of physics for a second, instead of making this table bigger, right, increasing the distance from the CPU itself, they smacked the table directly on top of it and added more cache equal distance from you so that it does not require any effort to reach for these books, right, to access this data. And so as a result, they increased their cache in this manner, known as Vcache. So Vcache, what is it? Vcache, or vertical cache, is cache that is physically stacked on top of the CPU die. Now here we have a 4-core representation of a CPU and a cache bank. In this case, for AMD CPUs, this is representative of about 64 megabytes of extra cache that are connected to the CPU die via these what are called through silicon vias, or TSVs. This is where the data is transferred through. Now, typically, let me move on to this image real quick. Typically, the CPU die itself has about 32 megabytes of L3 cache. What AMD decided to do is just smack an additional 64 megabytes directly on top of it, and that data is transferred through these TSV columns, okay? Why does this work? How is this helpful for computation? The number one reason, or the factor that it reduces by increasing the L3 cache, is the number of cache misses that occur. So what a cache miss is if you're the CPU and you send a request to access a specific data point that isn't in the cache, that's called a cache miss. And now it has to communicate with the main memory or even the long-term storage to get this data that it requires. Conversely, a cache hit is accessing that data directly on the cache, so it doesn't have that increased latency with communicating with the main memory or long-term storage. And so as a result of increasing the L3 cache, you reduce the number of cache misses, and consequentially, you increase the instructions per cycle. Now, to look at the performance of these CPUs and AMD's implementation of the X3D or vertical cache, I relied on a reputable reviewer in the industry. Some of you guys may know him as Stephen Burke or Gamers Nexus. He does some really good benchmarks that look at both gaming and production environments just to get the overall strengths and weaknesses of the CPUs. The first one that we'll be looking at is frames per second in Cyberpunk 2077, kind of considered the crisis of this day and age, right? Especially with ray tracing, but that's a different conversation. This benchmark, the higher the number, the better, okay? The second one looks at the production environment, or render time in minutes in Blender. Now, in this specific test, core count matters here. and we'll see that with the benchmarks. If you want more information on these diagrams, you can visit their website at gamersnexus.com. Now, the first one, very difficult. Unfortunately, they didn't have a white chart to look at, but looking at these first, I believe, what is that, 6, 7 CPUs, it's all dominated with AMD X3D CPUs. They wiped the competition. They wiped the floor against Intel, so much so that even their 6-year-old CPUs are outperforming Intel's latest Ultra series CPUs. That's nuts to think about, especially 6 years in computer architecture. That's a lifetime. That's a generation. Several generations, in fact. And yet they are still outperforming in gaming environments. Now, these gaming environments are inherently sequential. When we switch over to production environments, that's where we see the parallelizability shine. And so looking at the Blender benchmarks, we see that, sure, AMD is still on top with their 9950 X3D and their non-X3D counterpart, but Intel Core Ultra 9 comes in third place. Pretty close, but it's still a significant enough gap. And then that 5800 that we were discussing, that's 6 years old, is all the way down here. Now, although it has a large amount of V cache or L3 cache, it's lacking the core count. This is only 8 cores in comparison to 16 cores and 24 cores from Intel's CPUs. Now, Vcache is no worries. Vcache is great, but there are some limitations to Vcache, unfortunately, but it is expected. So the first one, as we've already seen, is that production environments do not benefit as much in regards to cache increases compared to core count. In those environments, the more cores you have, the better. Again, which was demonstrated in this chart here. The second point, which I frankly wasn't really discussed, but I came to this conclusion. So meaningful performance increases are only seen in what I like to call total cache per die increases. What does cache per die increases mean? So in AMD's latest CPU release, which happened, I believe, 3 weeks ago at this point, they released their 9950 X3D2. Sorry for the naming conventions, it's a mouthful, but what that CPU entails, or what it's comprised of, is 2 CPU die, similar to this diagram here, and both of them have Vcache implemented into them. So it has a total of 192 megabytes of L3 cache on a regular desktop computer. However, when benchmarks came out with this X3D2, it turns out that the 9800 X3D, which is the 8-core counterpart with only 96 megabytes of L3 cache, performed the same, if not better, in gaming environments. Again, in inherently sequential environments, against both the 9950 X3D and X3D2 variants, which are comprised of 16 cores, but 2 CPU die. So ultimately, the 9800 X3D and these bigger variants, they have the same amount of total cache per die. The 9950 X3D and X3D2 just have an additional die. So yeah, that's the limitation that AMD has. So if we do want to see any meaningful performance increases, we need to increase the amount of L3 cache on a singular die as opposed to adding additional die to a CPU. And then last but not least is the power consumption that increases as L3 cache increases. There haven't been any studies in regards to vertical cache, but there have been studies regarding server CPUs that have larger L3 cache in general. And in this specific paper, it was found that the large L3 cache of this server CPU represented about 30% of a CPU's power consumption, meaning that as we increase the cache, we're more than likely going to see or hit a similar power wall resembling the nature of that of clock frequency. Now, I just want to thank everyone for the wonderful projects that you guys did. It's been really nice seeing the things that interest you and the implementations regarding that. And then I specifically want to thank Dr. Chun for allowing us to shape our own experience and choose our own projects. So a round of applause for him. Thank you. And on that note, I'll open it with any questions, or I'll leave it with any questions.
So you mentioned that the performance differences between Intel and AMD over the last 6 years in strictly sequential like gaming workloads have been massively in AMD's favor. I'm reading that correctly.
Yes.
I'm curious, I mean, I get that production workloads are probably the bigger target market, but given that AMD has dominated in that field for so long, I'm curious why Intel hasn't tried to do more R&D into this themselves.
So, yeah, you do bring up a good point. It turns out that Intel actually is, at least nothing confirmed yet, but there have been rumors regarding what they call BLLC, or big last level cache, that Intel is apparently looking towards implementing. It's not necessarily vertical cache, again, based on these rumors. This isn't anything, don't quote me on this. But it does seem like Intel is trying to move in that direction to give their CPUs an edge against AMD's vertical cache, or in response to the V cache. Any other questions?
Does stacking the V cache on top of the CPU create thermal problems? Seems like it'd be harder to cool.
Surprisingly not. It turns out that that implementation that AMD used, it's a specific bonding that they call hybrid bonding. It allows them to have a more thermal efficient implementation as well as a increased density. Yeah, it was a very, very deep dive into it, but yeah, that's kind of their solution to it. Yeah.
Okay.
Hybrid bonding.
What about the cost though now? Because you're adding a lot of cache.
Yeah.
That's very expensive memory, right?
So evidently with the 9950 X3D 2, that CPU is marketed at around $900 now, in comparison to their 9800 X3D, which is around $450. Yeah, so that does increase the cost. Yeah.
Get what you pay for, right?
What's funnily enough though is that you don't really get more with performance with the 9950 X3D 2 when you can just buy the $600 counterpart that has less V-cache on the second die. Yeah, so it was an interesting decision that they made, AMD made.
Are some of those prices like inflated right now too, with like all of the shortages of like all the memory and like storage?
So with CPU, luckily they're not hit yet with AI. I hope they don't get hit, because we've already seen how drastic RAM and long-term storage is. They seem to still be stable. It's your typical supply and demand. So yeah, they have yet to be affected. I hope they don't get affected yet. But this is a desktop CPU anyways, so I don't think big companies would be looking to be purchasing those. They'd be looking at like Threadrippers or Intel Xeons. Yeah.
But that's kind of like what happened with all the DDR4 RAM, because all the DDR4 RAM, which was like $30 like last year,
Yeah.
is now
Like 300. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, because that's all the only thing left that consumers are able to buy.
Mhm.
So it's like, with the same thing happening with CPUs, we're only like,
We're-
they allocate most of their resources to making like server CPUs.
Yeah, no, for sure. Surprisingly enough, the 5800 X3D, even though it's 6 years old, AMD's bringing it back. We saw that with the 3060 Ti, I believe, as well. So yeah, that's all the information I got regarding that. But it does seem like it's still being affected regardless. Yeah. You had?
Yeah, so with like Mac, and I think Intel is also starting to do the performance and efficiency core. Do you think that, have you heard or can you speculate about the efficacy of having 3D V-cache on performance cores but not on efficiency cores?
That is an interesting one. I'm not sure regarding the architecture of Intel's CPUs itself and how they divide the performance cores, whether it's on one die and then they have the efficiency cores on a separate die. I imagine so. Specifically the 9950 X3D, it has two CPU die. So let's just say we have these two CPU die. Each one has their 8 cores. But this CPU die has the additional 64 megabytes of cache. This one does not. So I would imagine if they do decide to give, say, the performance cores the extra cache, it would be a similar design to the 9950 X3D. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you, Ricardo, again.
Thank you, guys.